At her wealthy sister's wedding, a pregnant single mom and her daughter were humiliated in front of everyone. But the groom found out the truth and stopped the ceremony. What happened next was something no one expected. Subscribe. Write in the comments what city or country you're watching from. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence of the small kitchen as Rachel leaned against the counter, her feet swollen from another 12-hour shift. The linoleum beneath her heels was cool, and the ticking of the wall clock measured out the stillness like a patient heartbeat. The house was quiet except for the faint rustle of a breeze through the cracked window above the sink, and in the next room, the gentle breathing of her daughter Ella as she slept. Rachel could hear the occasional sleepy sigh from the 6-year-old's room, a comfort she clung to in the silence that had become her life. The old farmhouse on the edge of town wasn't much, but it was theirs for now. The chipped paint and creaking floorboards told the story of every hard-earned dollar, every sacrifice she'd made since the day she found herself alone with a baby in her arms. And now, with another child on the way, the weight of that story grew heavier with each passing day. At 30, Rachel had come to know solitude not as a stranger, but as a roommate. It lingered in the quiet evenings, in the late-night budgeting over bills and groceries, in the prenatal appointments she attended alone, answering the nurse's questions with forced calm and practiced grace. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the new life inside her stirred restlessly. She whispered a soft, tired greeting, as she did each night, more for herself than the baby. There was a quiet desperation in her hope that this time, maybe, things would be different. But reality rarely bent to hope. The father of her unborn child, a fleeting presence with a winning smile and empty promises, had vanished the moment she told him. The echo of his absence had grown louder with each month, a familiar chorus in the life she had built with Ella. Rachel exhaled, wincing slightly as a sharp pain caught her side. She straightened slowly and shuffled to the table, where a stack of medical bills, grocery receipts, and school forms waited like a silent jury. Her paycheck, already allocated in her mind, would vanish as quickly as it came. She rubbed her temple, exhaustion settling like fog in her bones. It had been a long day. Mrs. Cartwright in room 208 had needed constant assistance, and Mr. Whitaker had pulled out his IV again. But through it all, Rachel had smiled, had offered warmth and kindness to strangers even when none was left for herself. That was the curse and gift of being a caregiver. You gave even when empty. The sound of soft footsteps broke through her thoughts. Ella appeared in the doorway, her blanket trailing behind her and her blonde curls tangled from sleep. Her eyes, wide and green like her father's, blinked up at Rachel with that mixture of innocence and understanding that sometimes made her seem much older than 6. "I had a dream," Ella mumbled, rubbing one eye. "There were stars in our room. Real ones." Rachel crouched carefully, her body protesting the movement, and pulled Ella close. "That sounds like a beautiful dream," she said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Maybe one day we'll have a place where you can see the stars every night." Ella looked up, thoughtful. "Do you think people can live in the sky? Like angels?" Rachel smiled faintly. "I think people can live in a lot of places, even in memories." They stood there in the soft glow of the kitchen light, a mother and daughter wrapped in an invisible thread of resilience. Rachel knew Ella didn't understand the full weight of their life yet, but she could sense it, like animals do before a storm. That quiet dread lived in the corners of their home, in the forgotten toys, the second-hand clothes, the birthday cards without return addresses. The next morning brought more of the same. Breakfast was toast and peanut butter, eaten in silence while Rachel read a letter she had been avoiding for 2 days. The return address was printed in gold. Her sister's handwriting, the loops too perfect to be sincere, stared back at her from the card's ivory surface. Madeline Annette White cordially invites you and your daughter to the celebration of her marriage to James Nathaniel Brooks, to be held at the Broughton Estate on Saturday, the 12th of next month at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Rachel stared at the embossed words, her throat dry. It was not the invitation that hurt, it was the formality, the sheer coldness. Her sister had never been warm, but this was a message written not to include her, but to remind her of the space between them. It was a decorative announcement of a life Rachel would never be part of. Madeline had always walked ahead with ease, born into the same family but raised in a different world. Where Rachel had learned to patch hand-me-downs and stretch dinners, Madeline had learned to smile through lies and charm money from the hands of men. She tossed the card onto the table, the sharp edges skimming across the worn wood like a paper blade. Ella looked up from her cereal, sensing something in her mother's face. "Are we going?" she asked. Rachel hesitated. "It's your aunt's wedding," she said carefully. "Do you want to go?" Ella nodded quickly, excitement lighting her face. "I've never been to a real wedding. Will there be cake?" "Probably," Rachel said, forcing a smile. "A very fancy cake." Later at work, Rachel confided in her coworker Linda during their lunch break in the nurses' lounge, a cramped space with a vending machine that ate coins and a microwave that sparked if you looked at it wrong. Linda, a woman in her 50s with a heart the size of the sun and a sharp tongue, shook her head. "That sister of yours is poison," she said, "but sometimes it's worth going just to let them see you still standing." Rachel knew she was right. It wasn't about pride. It was about presence, about showing Ella that they belonged anywhere they chose to go, that no matter how the world tried to frame them as burdens, mistakes, or shadows, they had every right to exist in the light. The days that followed were a blur of shift work, childcare, and small preparations. Rachel hemmed her old maternity dress by hand, staying up late after Ella had gone to sleep. She patched Ella's shoes with glue and prayer. Every detail, no matter how small, became a symbol of quiet resistance. She could not compete with Madeline's wealth, but she could walk in with dignity. And sometimes dignity was louder than diamonds. The night before they left, Rachel tucked Ella into bed and sat on the floor beside her, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She whispered a promise to both of her children, one sleeping, one yet unborn, that she would never allow anyone to make them feel less than enough, not even their own family. When dawn arrived, Rachel dressed Ella in a faded pink dress that still carried the scent of lavender detergent. She wore her own carefully mended dress, the fabric soft with age but clean, and pinned her hair back with a simple barrette. They packed sandwiches for the road and climbed into the car as the morning sun crept over the hills. As they drove out of town, past the gas station where Rachel bought groceries on credit, past the school where Ella's backpack hung on a hook marked W, Rachel felt the familiar sting of doubt creep in. The road ahead wound into uncertainty, into a place where her worth would be weighed against wealth, appearance, and pretense. But when she looked in the rearview mirror and saw Ella humming softly to herself, her stuffed rabbit cradled in her lap, Rachel felt something settle. A stillness, a resolve. She would walk into her sister's world not to ask for a seat, but to take one. Not to prove her worth, but to live it. The car turned off the main highway, tires crunching onto a narrow road framed by towering trees. Ahead, in the distance, the outline of the Broughton estate rose like a cathedral of affluence against the sky. It was grand, unwelcoming, and immaculate. Rachel took a breath, smoothed her dress over her belly, and whispered to herself the words she needed most. We are not less. We are not invisible. And with that, she drove on. The driveway curved in a grand arc, bordered by meticulously trimmed hedges and white hydrangeas that spilled over stone walls like lace. As Rachel turned onto the estate's grounds, the tires of her sedan rolled uneasily over the crushed gravel, every crack and crunch magnified in her chest like a heartbeat. The Broughton estate towered ahead, an expanse of white colonial brick framed by towering pillars, its windows glinting in the late morning sun, as if daring her to approach. It was the kind of house one only saw in magazines or films, where everything smelled of power and history, where the air itself seemed to hum with exclusion. Ella stirred in the back seat, blinking sleep from her eyes as she clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Is this it?" she whispered, her voice tinged with wonder. Rachel nodded, her throat tight, her hand absently smoothing her dress over the swell of her belly. She reached for the car door, her fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the handle. There was no turning back. They stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth clashing against the cold rising from her stomach. Rachel took Ella's hand, and together they walked toward the front entrance, the gravel shifting beneath their shoes like tiny protests. Before they could knock, the heavy oak door opened to reveal a young woman in a tailored uniform, her posture sharp and her expression unreadable. "May I help you?" she asked, eyes scanning Rachel's dress, the faint scuff on her shoes, the way her belly pushed against the seams. Rachel offered a smile she had practiced in countless hospital corridors. "We're here for Madeline White's wedding. I'm her sister, Rachel." Something flickered in the woman's face. Surprise, perhaps, or subtle recognition. She stepped aside with a nod. "Of course. They're in the East Garden." As they entered, the cool air of the foyer embraced them. Marble floors stretched beneath their feet, and above, a chandelier spilled light like a frozen cascade of diamonds. Ella clutched Rachel's hand tighter, her eyes wide with silent questions. Rachel whispered a soft reassurance, her voice steady despite the storm building behind her ribs. A voice rang out, shrill and practiced. "Rachel, is that you?" It came from the staircase where Madeline descended like a queen from a throne. Her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiled, her ivory blouse tucked into a silk skirt that shimmered with every step. She looked untouched by time, by hardship, by anything resembling reality. Rachel offered a cautious smile. "Hello, Madeline." Madeline's eyes flicked down to Rachel's belly, then to Ella, who stood half behind her mother's leg. "You look, well," she said, with just enough pause to make the word ache. "I didn't expect you so early. The welcome brunch doesn't start for another hour." "We wanted to be on time," Rachel replied. "Traffic, you know." Madeline gave a brittle laugh. "Of course. And this is Ella." She crouched down slightly, not enough to wrinkle her skirt, and gave a mockingly bright smile. "Hello, sweetheart." Ella clutched her rabbit tighter and nodded, her green eyes wary. "Well," Madeline said, straightening, "you'll be staying in the guest house, I assume. It's small, but I figured you'd be more comfortable away from the crowd." Rachel stiffened, but nodded. "That's fine." As they made their way through the house, Madeline offered a guided tour laced with not-so-subtle jabs. That painting was a gift from James's art dealer, modern expressionism. You wouldn't believe the price. And this is an original French sideboard, restored, of course. Some people can't tell the difference. Rachel responded with polite nods, her gaze trailing over the extravagance with quiet detachment. She had no desire to be impressed. The floors might gleam and the walls might echo with money, but there was no warmth here, no lived-in softness. It was a house built for appearances, and Madeline wore it like armor. Outside, the east garden looked like something from a curated catalog. White chairs were arranged in neat rows. Floral arches were being erected by a team of florists in matching polos, and tables were already being draped in linen cloths and pearl-toned centerpieces. Staff moved efficiently, their presence orchestrated like a dance. James appeared near the gazebo, speaking with the coordinator. He wore pressed slacks and a navy button-down rolled at the sleeves, revealing strong forearms and a wristwatch that glinted with subtle elegance. He looked up and noticed them, his gaze pausing on Rachel with something close to curiosity. He excused himself from the conversation and approached. "You must be Rachel," he said, his voice smooth but sincere. "Madeline's told me about you." Rachel met his eyes, surprised by their warmth. "All good things, I hope." He chuckled. "Depends on your definition of good." Ella looked up at him, squinting. "You're really tall." James crouched to her level, his face open. "And you're really brave to come here. That must be your best friend." He pointed to the rabbit. Ella beamed for the first time that morning. Rachel watched the exchange, something shifting uneasily inside her. No one in Madeline's world ever knelt to children or noticed the ones who didn't shine. She studied James's face, wondering what he saw in her sister, what he hadn't yet seen. They were shown to the guest house, which sat across the lawn behind a row of hedges. It was small, yes, but clean and quiet. Rachel unpacked their things while Ella explored the unfamiliar space, her small voice bouncing from room to room like a butterfly. Later that afternoon, the welcome brunch began. Guests arrived in sleek cars, wearing clothes Rachel had only seen in shop windows. Laughter floated through the air like perfume, light and detached. She stood with a glass of water in hand, enduring introductions and tight smiles, aware of how many eyes landed on her stomach before quickly looking away. Madeline was in her element, draped in designer labels and surrounded by friends with manicured nails and champagne flutes. She held court beneath the garden canopy, and when Rachel approached, conversation shifted. Someone whispered the word nurse. Another offered a tight-lipped smile and said, "It's so inspiring that you're raising a child alone." And another on the way, "That's strength." Rachel nodded, her spine straight. Children aren't burdens, they're blessings, even when it's hard. The woman blinked, unsure how to respond. The group soon moved on. James found her by the drinks table, where she was refilling Ella's cup with lemonade. "You're braver than I am," he said. "These events make me feel like I'm in a museum where I don't belong." Rachel arched a brow. "You? You own half the museum." James laughed. "Doesn't mean I'm comfortable in it, not really." She studied him again, noting the way he stood slightly apart, a subtle tension in his shoulders. "Why are you marrying her?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked surprised, but not offended. "Because I thought I was supposed to." That night, after Ella was asleep, Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, her feet aching, her heart restless. Outside, music floated from the main house, a celebration she hadn't been invited to. She rested her hands on her belly and exhaled. Something about this place. It wasn't just exclusion, it was erosion, a slow wearing away of self. And yet, in James's voice she had heard something else. Doubt, kindness, maybe even a question he hadn't yet asked himself. She lay down beside her daughter and whispered into the dark. We belong wherever we choose to stand. The next morning would bring rehearsals, fittings, more forced smiles. But for now, she had this: her daughter's breath, steady and warm, and the knowledge that civility could be a mask, but truth had a way of cracking through. The morning broke with a mist that hung low over the garden, softening the edges of the estate and lending a strange hush to everything. Rachel stood at the window of the guest house, one hand resting on her belly as she watched the staff begin their work for the day. Tables were being set with precise care, each plate and napkin folded to match a standard only people like Madeline could truly appreciate. It was a world built on appearances, on rehearsed smiles and silent expectations, and it thrived in the absence of authenticity. Ella was still asleep in the second bedroom, curled up under the quilt Rachel had packed from home. Her stuffed rabbit lay beside her, well-worn and threadbare in one ear, a contrast to the pristine surroundings. Rachel took a long breath and turned from the window, the aches of late pregnancy reminding her that she needed to pace herself. But she had no time for rest. Today was the rehearsal brunch, another performance of curated perfection, and her sister had already sent a text at dawn. Please wear something appropriate, no florals, and remember, people will be watching. Rachel had laughed aloud when she read it. Not bitterly, just the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion, from being so far removed from someone's world that their demands begin to feel absurd. She chose a pale blue dress, one of the few pieces in her closet that still fit and didn't scream thrift store, and pinned her hair back. Her belly, prominent now, was impossible to hide, and she didn't try. She had carried this child through silence and fear, through heartbreak and night shifts. It was not a mark of shame. It was proof of survival. The brunch was held under a white tent on the south lawn, where the view of the lake stretched wide and still. Guests milled about in pastel linens and summer dresses, holding glasses of mimosas and commenting on the weather with the precision of people who avoided true conversation. Rachel walked slowly, one hand in Ella's, her presence ignored by most, acknowledged only by the polite nods that implied, "You must be someone's cousin." She found a spot near the back and lowered herself carefully onto a chair, her body heavy with effort. Madeline appeared shortly after, radiant in a cream dress that seemed designed to float rather than fit. Her hair was woven into a perfect knot, her makeup a work of symmetry and gloss. She made her way around the tent like a swan gliding across glass, touching arms, laughing softly, orchestrating the tone of the gathering with every calculated movement. When she reached Rachel, she paused, her smile polite but tight. "I see you found a seat," she said, eyes scanning the empty chair beside her. "I did," Rachel replied. "Hope that's all right." Madeline gave a light laugh. "Of course. I just assumed you might want to sit closer to the edge. Easier to leave if Ella gets restless." "She's fine," Rachel said, glancing at her daughter, who was quietly coloring with the set of pencils she'd brought in her backpack. "She knows how to behave." "Well," Madeline said, her tone syrupy, "we'll see how long that lasts." Then she turned, dismissing her with the same grace she used to welcome senators and CEOs. Rachel watched her sister move among the guests and wondered if there had ever been a time when Madeline had been real. As children, they had shared a bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a single window that let in just enough light. Back then, Madeline had braided Rachel's hair and whispered stories about the life they'd someday live. Mansions, husbands, travel, anything but the life their mother had clawed through. But somewhere between high school and inheritance, Madeline had traded dreams for masks, warmth for shine. Rachel had been left behind like an unfinished sentence. Later that afternoon, Rachel wandered into the main house to find a restroom. She moved through the back hallway, past a room she hadn't noticed before, where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, she heard laughter. Madeline's unmistakable laugh, sharp and crystalline. She paused, a quiet unease prickling along her neck. "He'll never know," Madeline said, her voice low and conspiratorial. Another woman laughed, a shrill, breathy sound. "You're awful." "I'm honest," Madeline replied. "James is he's what I need right now. Dark enough to look progressive, rich enough to shut up my board, and naive enough to think this is about love." Rachel froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The words were tossed out like confetti, careless and cold. She edged closer, enough to see through the sliver of space between the door and the frame. Madeline stood with two bridesmaids, both sipping cocktails and nodding like courtiers. "But what if he finds out how you really feel?" one of them asked. Madeline shrugged. "He won't. He's still dazzled. And once the papers are signed, well, he can go back to saving the world while I host fundraisers and wear tasteful African prints. Everyone wins." Rachel stepped back, the nausea rising in her throat more from disgust than pregnancy. She turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the polished floors. The laughter followed her like a shadow. That evening, she sat outside the guest house, Ella asleep inside, and stared up at the stars that were just beginning to prick the sky. The air was cooler now, laced with the scent of gardenias. Her mind spun with what she'd heard, what she'd felt, and the strange ache that had taken root in her chest. James wasn't perfect. No one was. But he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be a prop in someone else's performance. Rachel wondered if she should tell him, if it was her place. Would he believe her? Would it matter? The next day, James appeared at the guest house door with a bag of pastries and 2 cups of coffee. Rachel, still in her robe, blinked in surprise. "I thought you might appreciate something not catered," he said, holding out the bag. She accepted it slowly. "Thank you." He leaned against the porch railing, watching the garden. "This place makes me feel like a visitor in my own life." Rachel sat across from him, the coffee warm in her hands. "Then why are you still here?" He hesitated. "Because I keep thinking it'll change. That if I love hard enough, things will soften. But I'm not sure love should feel like erosion." Rachel looked at him, really looked, and saw a man unraveling in silence, trying to hold together a dream he hadn't built for himself. She wanted to tell him everything, but she didn't. Not yet. Not here. Instead, she said, "Love should be a place you come home to, not a place you perform in." James met her eyes, something shifting behind his. He nodded slowly. "You're right." He left soon after, and Rachel watched him go, her heart heavier than before. Inside, Ella stirred and called out for her, and Rachel returned to the small warmth of their space. She held her daughter close and whispered, "I'm here. I've got you." But even as she soothed her child, she knew the days ahead would not be kind. The cracks beneath the polish were widening, and the truth had started to rise. The question was no longer if it would surface, but when, and what would be left standing when it did. The following morning crept in slowly, veiled in gray clouds that clung to the sky like secrets not yet confessed. Rachel woke to the sound of light rain tapping gently against the guest house windows, a rhythmic reminder that not everything in the world bowed to perfection. She sat up carefully, one hand instinctively resting on the slope of her belly, the other brushing her damp hair back from her face. The ache in her back had worsened overnight, a dull but constant weight, but she welcomed the discomfort. It reminded her she was still here, still carrying life, still fighting through each day with the stubborn resilience of a woman who had survived too much to surrender now. Ella was already awake, sitting cross-legged at the kitchen table with a crayon in one hand and a piece of folded paper in the other. She looked up as her mother entered, offering a sleepy smile. "I'm making a card," she said proudly, "for you and the baby." Rachel crossed the room and kissed her daughter's head, inhaling the soft scent of her hair, the kind that only belonged to children untouched by the world's cruelty. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured, running a hand gently over Ella's back. "That's beautiful." As she prepared a simple breakfast, Rachel couldn't shake the residue of what she'd heard the day before. Madeline's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp, glib, and cruel. Every word had cut with surgical precision, laced with a venom that suggested not just opportunism, but contempt. James had no idea who he was marrying. He didn't see the mask, only the glint, and Rachel, for all her weariness, for all her silence, couldn't pretend anymore that it wasn't her place to speak. She didn't yet know what she would do. She wasn't naive. Truth, when wielded without care, could destroy as easily as it could liberate. And James wasn't just some man. He was kind. He knelt when Ella spoke. He looked at people with both eyes and heart. But she needed to understand what he meant to Madeline, what he didn't mean. After breakfast, the day unfolded slowly, each hour marked by rehearsals, fittings, tastings, and countless other ceremonies disguised as tasks. Rachel kept mostly to herself, her presence tolerated but never truly acknowledged. She watched as the event swallowed everyone whole, guests and family moving like pieces on a glossy board, and, at the center of it all, Madeline shone like a star about to go supernova, too brilliant and too unstable to last. In the afternoon, Rachel slipped away from the crowd and found herself walking the path behind the estate, where a line of ancient oaks stood like sentinels. The wind rustled through their branches, whispering things only trees remember. She followed the trail until she reached the edge of the small lake that bordered the property. The water was calm, a smooth mirror of the cloud-covered sky. She sat carefully on a bench near the shore, the wood damp but solid beneath her, and let the silence settle around her like a shawl. Memories came then, uninvited and vivid. Her childhood with Madeline had not always been cruel. There had been moments, brief and flickering, where they had existed not as rivals but as sisters. She remembered summer afternoons playing in the backyard of their modest house, making crowns from dandelions and pretending the plastic wading pool was a kingdom. She remembered the night their father left, how Madeline had crept into her bed and held her hand in the dark, whispering that everything would be fine, but that Madeline had disappeared as they grew older, replaced by someone sharper, colder, someone who learned how to climb by pushing others down. Rachel had never been a fighter by nature. Her strength was quiet, coiled deep in her bones. She had learned to survive, to endure, to carry weight without complaint. But now, watching the reflection of the estate tremble slightly in the lake, she felt something stir. Not anger, not yet, but a resolve that felt dangerously close to defiance. Later that evening, as dusk spilled over the horizon, a dinner was held in the formal dining room, a room so ornate it felt like a museum exhibit. Rachel had been seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, her name written in delicate cursive on a white place card. Ella sat beside her, quietly buttering a roll. Madeline sat near the center, flanked by bridesmaids and old school friends, her laughter filling the room like perfume. James was across from her, speaking politely, but with less enthusiasm than usual. Rachel could see it now, the subtle fatigue in his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach his mouth. Something in him had begun to shift. Perhaps it had been gradual, a slow erosion of illusion, or perhaps he was beginning to listen to his own doubt. At one point during the meal, Madeline stood to make a small toast. "To family," she said, raising her glass, "and to the journey that brought us all together, no matter how winding." There were polite chuckles, a few knowing looks. Rachel didn't react. She reached for her water and sipped slowly, her fingers steady even as her stomach churned. When the guests retired to the parlor for brandy and music, Rachel lingered behind. The room emptied gradually, the clink of crystal replaced by the muted thump of a distant jazz record. She stood and made her way toward the hallway, intending to check on Ella, who had been invited to join the other children for a movie in the media room. As she passed the library, she heard voices again, low and urgent. "She's going to ruin it," Madeline hissed. Rachel froze, her body rigid. "She doesn't belong here. She never has. And now she's dragging that child around like some badge of pity. I swear, if James spends one more second looking at her like she's some damn saint, I'll—" The rest was muffled, but Rachel had heard enough. That night, she sat on the edge of Ella's bed, brushing the girl's hair back from her face as she slept. Her daughter's breathing was soft, her expression peaceful. Rachel stared at her for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the lawn. Somewhere out there, Madeline was likely sipping champagne, wrapping herself in false adoration. Rachel knew what she had to do. The idea of confrontation made her stomach twist, but this was no longer about revenge. It was about truth, about protecting the innocents beside her, about standing for something more than silence. She remembered what Linda had told her once after a brutal shift at the hospital. Sometimes dignity is just standing still while the world tries to push you down. Rachel had stood still long enough. She placed a hand over her belly and whispered, "You deserve more than this." Then she whispered the same to herself. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the air. But for the first time, Rachel wasn't afraid. The cracks beneath the polish were widening, and the truth, ugly, raw, and necessary, was ready to break through. All she had to do was let it. The wedding morning dawned with an unnerving stillness, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The clouds were high and thin, stretching like gauze across the pale blue expanse, and the wind carried a strange coolness that hinted at an approaching shift. Rachel stood in front of the small mirror in the guest house bathroom, pinning back her hair with careful fingers. Her reflection was pale but composed, her blue dress pressed and clean, the neckline modest, the hem reaching just below her knees. She looked like a woman trying to disappear in plain sight, and yet today she had no intention of fading into the background. Ella sat on the edge of the bed behind her, swinging her legs and watching her mother with a quiet sense of admiration. She wore a pale pink dress with a white ribbon in her hair, the same one they had picked out together at the thrift store weeks ago. Her shoes had been polished until they shone, and the way she held herself, chin lifted, shoulders back, made her look older than her 6 years. Rachel had taught her that, to hold her head high even when the world tried to drag it down. "You look like a princess," Ella whispered. Rachel turned, smiling gently as she crouched beside her daughter. "And you look like the reason I keep going," she replied, brushing a stray curl from Ella's cheek. They left the guest house together, hand in hand, walking slowly across the manicured lawn toward the main estate. Staff bustled about, carrying trays of glasses, adjusting centerpieces, and sweeping away invisible specks of dust from walkways already pristine. It was the kind of perfection that required relentless control, every element choreographed to maintain the illusion. Rachel had seen it all before, and yet something about today felt different, charged, on edge. Inside the grand parlor, guests began to gather, their voices a murmur of anticipation. The ceremony was scheduled for noon, and already the pews of the nearby chapel had been filled with silk programs and delicate rose petals. Rachel and Ella arrived early, as instructed. Madeline didn't like latecomers. She didn't like disruptions, deviations, or disorder of any kind. Rachel had only just taken her seat near the back of the main hall when Madeline appeared, flanked by her bridesmaids like a queen with her court. She was dressed in a robe of ivory satin, her makeup immaculate, her lips painted the color of crushed rubies. Her hair was swept into a low chignon, anchored with pearl pins. She looked flawless, manufactured, untouchable. When her eyes found Rachel, her expression faltered for the briefest second, then recovered into a smile too sharp to be sincere. "Well," she said, approaching with a glide in her step, "you actually look decent." Rachel rose slowly. "Good morning, Madeline." Madeline's gaze dropped to Rachel's belly. "You're quite the statement piece today. Let's just hope you don't go into labor mid-ceremony. That would be dramatic." "I'll try to keep it contained," Rachel replied evenly. "Do," Madeline said, then turned to Ella. "And you, little one, don't touch anything, all right? These dresses cost more than your mother's car." Rachel gently pulled Ella closer, her smile not reaching her eyes. "She'll be fine. She knows how to behave." Madeline gave a dismissive nod and turned away, her entourage fluttering behind her like well-trained birds. Rachel watched her go, her jaw tight, her fingers resting on the curve of her belly in a gesture that had become almost protective. The ceremony began on time. The chapel was filled with white roses and gold-trimmed candles, the aisle lined with silk ribbons and pews filled with elegantly dressed guests. Rachel sat near the front, beside Ella, who watched everything with wide eyes and the kind of quiet excitement only a child could possess. James stood at the altar, looking every bit the polished groom in his tailored black suit, his expression composed but distant. Rachel saw the way his eyes searched the crowd more than once, pausing briefly when they found hers. She gave him a small nod, and he returned it with a flicker of something unreadable. Then the music swelled, and Madeline appeared at the back of the chapel, her gown a shimmering river of lace and tulle. The guests rose in unison, gasping softly as she began her walk down the aisle. Rachel felt the weight of the moment press against her chest, heavy and full of false promises. This was the performance Madeline had spent her life rehearsing, and now the stage was set. The ceremony passed without flaw. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and the priest declared them husband and wife beneath the vaulted arches and golden light. Applause rose as Madeline and James kissed, their silhouettes framed by stained glass windows that painted the scene in holy hues. The reception followed shortly after, held in the estate's grand ballroom, a space so ornate it bordered on obscene. Chandeliers glittered overhead, casting fractal light onto the polished floors. Tables were adorned with crystal goblets and floral arrangements tall enough to obstruct conversation. A string quartet played in the corner, and servers moved like ghosts, silent and efficient. Rachel found herself seated at a table near the edge of the room, a strategic placement no doubt chosen by Madeline. Still, she smiled for Ella's sake, pointing out the cake, the musicians, the guests in their finery. Her daughter beamed, unaware of the undercurrents beneath the glamour. Madeline's voice rang out as she took the microphone, her new husband beside her. "Thank you all for being here on the happiest day of my life," she began, her tone light and practiced. "It means so much to have our closest friends and family here to witness this beautiful union." She continued with acknowledgments, thanking her parents, her bridesmaids, the planners, the florist. Then her gaze swept the room and landed on Rachel. "I want to take a moment," she said, her smile sharpening, "to thank someone else. My sister, Rachel, who joined us today despite her circumstances." The room grew quiet. "She's always been the strong one, the responsible one," Madeline went on, "raising a child on her own, pregnant again. Brave, really. She shows us all that even when no one wants you, you can still show up." A few guests chuckled nervously. Rachel felt Ella's hand slip into hers under the table. "And who knows," Madeline added with a mock hopeful shrug, "maybe someone here is feeling generous. She's still on the market, folks. 2-for-1 package." The laughter was louder this time, sharper. Rachel's vision blurred, her skin burned. She could feel every pair of eyes turning toward her, some pitying, some amused. She rose from her seat, heart pounding, ready to walk out, to run if she had to, when James moved. He stepped forward, gently took the microphone from Madeline's hand, and turned to face the crowd. His expression had changed. The polished smile was gone, replaced by something raw. Fury, yes, but also something deeper. Clarity. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "but I can't let that stand." Madeline blinked at him, confused. "What are you doing?" James turned to the guests. This day was supposed to be about love, about truth, but I've just heard one of the ugliest things a person can say, and I can't let it go. He looked at Rachel. She's not the one who should be ashamed. She's the only person in this room who has shown strength without cruelty, love without conditions, and presence without pretense. He turned back to the crowd. "You should know who I almost married. A woman who uses people, who hides her prejudice behind charm, who mocks the very life I've built to honor my family and my values." Gasps filled the room. A glass shattered. "I'm calling off this wedding," he said, his voice steady, "and not because of nerves or doubts, but because I finally see the truth." He turned to Madeline, who stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "You don't love me," James said. "You love what I represent. You love the story, the optics, the mask. But I am not your accessory." Madeline lunged toward him, but he stepped back, calm even in the face of her unraveling. He walked toward Rachel, knelt beside Ella, and said softly, "You were the first person who saw me. Thank you." Then he stood and offered Rachel his hand. Her legs felt weak, but she rose, her heart racing. Ella clutched her other hand, and together they walked out, leaving behind the chandeliers, the music, and the gasping silence. Outside, the air was sharp and cool. The wind lifted Rachel's hair as they stepped onto the lawn, and she inhaled deeply, the weight on her chest finally beginning to lift. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The mask had cracked. The performance was over. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten. Freedom. The sun had barely begun its descent when they reached the edge of town. the late afternoon light slanting through the windshield in soft golden bands. Rachel sat in the passenger seat of James's car, her hands folded over her belly, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of her dress. Ella dozed in the back seat, her head resting against the window, her ribbon slightly askew, and her stuffed rabbit tucked tightly in her arms. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that followed truth, the kind that came when words were no longer a barrier, but a bridge waiting to be crossed. James drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely in his lap. His posture was relaxed, but Rachel could feel the tension still coiled inside him, just beneath the surface. He had done something irreversible. The image of him standing before the crowd, denouncing the wedding, stripping the mask from Madeline's carefully constructed persona. It played in her mind again and again, each time more vivid. It hadn't just been a moment of bravery. It had been a severing, a deliberate act of rejection not just of Madeline, but of the entire world she represented. They stopped at a small coastal restaurant on the outskirts of town, its wooden deck stretching out toward the water, fairy lights flickering along the railing. It was quiet inside, half empty, with soft music playing overhead and the scent of grilled seafood in the air. The hostess recognized James immediately, but said nothing beyond a polite smile as she led them to a table near the window. Rachel helped Ella into a chair and removed her own coat, grateful to be somewhere simple, somewhere real. James sat down across from her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and spoke quietly. "I'm sorry." Rachel looked at him, startled. "You don't need to apologize." "I do," he said. "Not for what I did today, but for what I didn't see, for how long I didn't see it." She studied him in the amber light. "Sometimes it takes the wrong person to show us what we really need." James exhaled slowly. "I thought Madeline was the answer. I thought if I checked all the boxes, did what was expected, maybe the hole inside me would fill. She was perfect on paper, beautiful, smart, ambitious. But none of that matters when there's nothing underneath." Rachel's fingers tightened around her glass. "She never saw you." "Not really." "She never asked about my mother," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "Never asked about my childhood, about the people who made me who I am. She wanted a resume, not a man." Rachel reached out, her hand brushing his briefly. "She didn't deserve you." His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, the weight between them shifted. There was history now, not just of the past week, but of something older, deeper, unspoken yet undeniable. Ella stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, then at Rachel, then at James. "Is the wedding over?" Rachel nodded gently. "Yes, baby, it's over." Ella considered this for a moment, then looked out the window. "Good. I didn't like the lady in the white dress." James smiled, the first genuine smile Rachel had seen from him all day. "You've got good instincts." They ordered dinner, though none of them ate much. The food sat mostly untouched between them as conversation drifted from topic to topic. Ella's school, Rachel's work at the hospital, James's business and the travel it required. They spoke not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as people who had found, unexpectedly, a shared rhythm. There were pauses, of course, but not the kind that signaled discomfort. They were the kind of silences that came when there was too much to say and no need to rush. As the sky darkened outside, turning from lavender to deep navy, Rachel found herself watching James more closely. The way he looked at Ella, not as a burden, but as a person. The way he listened without interruption. the way his gaze lingered on Rachel when he thought she wasn't paying attention. When the check came, he paid without a word, and they stepped back out into the night. The breeze had picked up, brisk and salty, and Rachel pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Ella walked between them, holding both their hands, swinging slightly with each step. They drove in silence again, the road empty save for a few passing headlights. James dropped them off at a small motel on the edge of town. Clean, modest, the kind of place Rachel could afford for now. He insisted on walking them to the room. At the door, Rachel turned to him uncertain. "You don't have to stay." "I know," he said, but he didn't leave. Instead, he knelt and looked Ella in the eye. "I meant what I said today. You're brave. You made someone I loved very happy once." Ella tilted her head. "Who?" He hesitated, then smiled softly. "My sister. She was sick a long time ago, and someone just like you made her laugh when no one else could." Ella looked up at her mother. "Was that me?" Rachel nodded slowly. "It was you, baby. You were just very little, but you helped someone in a big way." Ella seemed to accept this, then yawned and wandered into the room. James straightened, his expression more serious now. "I meant what I said to you, too. You don't deserve to be treated the way they treated you." Rachel looked at him, her voice low. "I've spent my whole life believing I had to be small, invisible, like that was the only way to survive." "Not anymore," James said. "You don't have to disappear to be worthy." Something inside her cracked open, not from pain, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. She reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you for today, for seeing me." He nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." He left after that, the promise of return unspoken but understood. Rachel watched his car disappear into the night, then turned and entered the room where Ella was already tucked into bed, her breathing slow and even. Rachel sat on the edge of the mattress, one hand resting on her daughter's back, the other pressed over her own heart. The next morning, they rose early and drove to Mount Batty Cemetery. It sat on a hill just outside of town, the grass thick with dew and the trees casting long shadows across the stones. James met them at the entrance, carrying a bouquet of white daisies. He didn't speak much as they walked the winding path to a small headstone near the edge of the ridge. It was simple, etched with a name and the word beloved. Rachel stood back as James knelt, placing the flowers gently at the base of the stone. Then Ella stepped forward, pulling something from her coat pocket. It was a small stone she had painted herself, covered in stars and a yellow sun. "I made this," she said softly, "for the lady who liked my drawings." James's shoulders shook slightly. Rachel moved to him, placing a hand on his back. "She would have loved that," he whispered. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, as the breeze rustled through the trees and the sun slowly crept higher in the sky. When they finally turned to leave, James reached for Rachel's hand. She didn't pull away. They walked down the hill together, not a family by name, not yet. But something stronger than coincidence had brought them here, and in the quiet that followed, there was peace. For Rachel, it was the first time in years that she felt like the world had opened instead of closed. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. And that was more than enough. A year passed, not like a sudden gust of wind, but as a slow unraveling of seasons. Spring yielded to a bright, forgiving summer, which softened into the rust tones of fall before the hush of winter settled in. The days layered themselves like quiet threads. Work days, school drop-offs, late nights with Coco and cartoons, weekends at the park, doctor's appointments, scraped knees, and the whisper of lullabies in a small room that smelled of baby powder and hope. Rachel no longer measured time in deadlines or due notices. She counted growth: Ella's first missing tooth, her newborn son's first smile, her own first laugh in years that wasn't born from disbelief. The office on Main Street bore her name now: Orley Financial Services. A modest space on the ground floor of a brick building with ivy that curled up its corners and framed the windows like green lace. The doorbell jingled when clients came in, and the walls were a soft dove gray, adorned with hand-drawn artwork from Ella and crayon stars made by tiny, clumsy fingers. There was a sense of purpose in the air, of dignity woven into every appointment and spreadsheet. The desk was hers. The chairs, the phone line, the accounts, hers, each earned, not given. It had been James's idea to put her name on the sign. People need to know who's behind the magic, he'd said with that steady smile, the one that made her feel seen in a way no one ever had before. He'd even painted the trim himself on a Sunday afternoon while Ella supervised with a clipboard and a plastic tiara. Rachel had watched from the doorway, her son asleep against her chest in a sling, and felt something that once seemed impossible: safety. James had never left. Not after the wedding. Not after the scandal that rippled through the community like a dropped stone in the still water. Madeline's world had crumbled in elegant pieces, endorsements withdrawn, social invites drying up, business prospects narrowing with each whisper of what had happened that day. Her carefully maintained persona, once polished to a high shine, had cracked irreparably in public view. She had tried to rebuild, at first with feigned innocence, then with manufactured outrage, until even that became too exhausting to sustain. By fall, she had moved away, leaving behind unanswered voicemails laced with the fragile apologies and bitter undertones. Rachel never responded. James never spoke ill of her, not even once. But there was a sadness that occasionally flickered in his eyes when her name was mentioned, a mourning not of the relationship, but of the illusion he had once believed in. Still, he focused forward, not backward. He had work to do, lives to build, and 2 children who looked at him now as more than a guest in their world. He didn't move in right away. It was Rachel's choice. She needed time to breathe, to feel the strength of her own spine before leaning into someone else's arms. But he came over most nights, brought groceries, helped with homework, rocked the baby when she needed sleep. He never asked for credit. He just showed up. Again and again, until it was clear he wasn't showing up for recognition. He was showing up because this was home. Ella adored him. She started calling him Jay because it was easier than James and felt more like theirs. The baby, a boy they named Samuel after Rachel's father, lit up every time he walked into a room. He learned first to reach for James's face, then to laugh when he heard his voice, then to crawl toward his footsteps. It was slow, this stitching together of hearts and habits, but it was strong. It held. That Christmas Eve, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. The house they now rented together was small but warm, its living room glowing with the golden flicker of the fire. Ella lay curled on the couch, her arms wrapped around her brother, who gurgled in delight as she showed him a picture book. Colored lights blinked along the mantel, and in the corner stood a Christmas tree they had decorated as a family, its branches heavy with mismatched ornaments and handmade stars. Rachel sat cross-legged on the rug, a mug of cocoa warming her hands. James sat beside her, his gaze focused not on the fire, but on her. The silence between them was easy, filled with the sound of the children's laughter and the crackle of burning wood. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. She watched him, her brow furrowed slightly as he pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been waiting for this moment," he said quietly. Rachel's heart stilled. He opened the box, revealing a delicate emerald ring, vintage in design, the stone set in a halo of tiny diamonds. It glowed in the firelight like a drop of forest, rich and deep and alive. "This was Emily's," he said, his voice thick. "She asked me once, before she passed, to give it to someone who showed me what love actually means. I didn't understand it then. I do now." Tears burned behind Rachel's eyes, but she didn't blink. Not yet. "Rachel," he said, "you don't need rescuing. You never did, but I want to be with you. Not because you need me, because I need you, because together we've already built something that feels like truth." He held the ring toward her. "Will you marry me?" Her gaze dropped to the ring, then to the children on the couch, then back to James's face. She had once imagined a proposal would feel like a dream, sudden, sweeping, unreal. But this wasn't a dream. It was solid. It was built on a year of dishes and diaper changes, late-night drives, and early morning smiles. It was built on hard conversations, gentle gestures, and unwavering presence. They were already a family. Still, she smiled through her tears and nodded. "Yes, let's make it official." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and his hand trembling just slightly. It fit perfectly, as if it had waited for her all along. They kissed, not with fireworks, but with something deeper, a recognition, a homecoming. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the fire had dimmed to embers, Rachel stood by the window and looked out at the falling snow. The street outside was quiet, the world hushed in white. Behind her, James wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. She leaned into him, the ring warm against her skin. "That for the first time in my life, I'm not surviving, I'm living." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the earth in silence and softness. Inside, Rachel held the hand of the man who had chosen truth over comfort, love over image. She listened to the gentle breathing of the children she had carried, fought for, raised with every fiber of her being. She closed her eyes. She was no longer the woman who had arrived at her sister's estate with second-hand shoes and a fractured heart. She was something more, a mother, a partner, a woman who had been dismissed and diminished, but never broken, a woman who had finally stepped into the light. And this time, she wasn't leaving it. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives that speak to the heart. Watch the next story and explore others on the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.